It is the morning of the 13th of August, 1940. The Australian capital, still young and sparsely developed, lies beneath a ceiling of low grey cloud. The land around the city rises and falls in gentle ridgelines and wooded slopes, broken by rocky outcrops and narrow valleys. In winter, the weather here often closes in quickly. Clouds descend into the hills, swallowing ridges and flattening the horizon. On mornings like this, distance becomes difficult to judge. Shapes fade, hills vanish into mist. At a small military airfield outside the capital, a twin-engine aircraft approaches from the south. The aircraft is a Lockheed Hudson, operated by the Royal Australian Air Force. Originally designed as a maritime patrol bomber, the Hudson has also become an important transport aircraft during the early months of the war. Its engines hum steadily as it moves through the overcast sky. Inside the aircraft, 10 men are traveling toward Canberra. Several of them are among the most senior figures in the Australian government during the opening year of World War II. Among the passengers are 3 cabinet ministers: Geoffrey Street, Minister for the Army; James Fairbairn, Minister for Air and Civil Aviation; Henry Summer Goulet, Minister for Information. Also on board is Brudnell White, recently appointed Chief of the General Staff, one of the most respected military officers in the country. Their destination is Canberra, where wartime meetings and strategic discussions continue almost daily. Australia has entered a global conflict, and decisions made in this quiet capital now carry weight far beyond its modest streets. The flight itself is routine. Military aircraft carry officials between Australian cities regularly. The Hudson is considered a capable aircraft, fast, stable, and well suited for long distances. But the conditions surrounding Canberra this morning are less forgiving. The cloud base hangs low across the surrounding ranges. Visibility shifts from mile to mile. In places, the hills disappear completely into the gray. In 1940, aircraft do not yet possess the sophisticated navigation and terrain awareness systems that would later become standard. Pilots rely on a combination of radio signals, maps, compass headings, and visual reference to the ground. When the ground itself vanishes into cloud, the margin for error narrows. As the Hudson approaches Canberra, the aircraft begins to descend. Below the cloud layer lies a landscape of ridges and wooded slopes that rise gradually toward the capital. Many of these hills appear gentle from a distance, but in poor visibility they can emerge suddenly, dark shapes against the pale fog. The pilot guides the aircraft through the overcast, relying on instruments and judgment developed through years of flying. Somewhere beneath the aircraft, hidden in the low cloud, stands a ridge known locally as Fairbairn Hill, part of the terrain surrounding the Canberra Basin. The Hudson continues descending. From the ground, the aircraft cannot yet be seen. The cloud hides everything above the treetops. Only the distant rumble of twin radial engines briefly echoes across the hills before fading again into the wind. Inside the cockpit, instruments glow softly against the dim gray light filtering through the windscreen. Altimeter, compass, airspeed indicator. Each provides a fragment of the aircraft's position, but none can see the ground. In modern aviation, a cockpit might carry digital terrain mapping, radar altimeters, and automated warning systems that alert crews when rising terrain lies ahead. In 1940, such systems do not exist. Instead, pilots depend on procedure, training, and situational awareness built from experience. For most flights, that is enough. But when cloud closes over unfamiliar terrain, the sky and the earth can begin to resemble each other, both reduced to shifting shades of gray. The Hudson continues toward Canberra. Below the aircraft, the wooded slopes remain hidden beneath mist. Somewhere within those clouds, altitude and terrain are drawing closer together. The aircraft is still under control. Its engines continue to run normally. Its flight path appears steady. Yet in aviation, some accidents unfold without warning. without fire, without mechanical failure. They occur when an aircraft, fully functional and fully controllable, unknowingly approaches the ground. A moment later, the quiet morning over Canberra will be interrupted by a sudden impact against the hillside. The event will become known as the 1940 Canberra Air Disaster. All 10 men aboard the aircraft will lose their lives. For Australia, the loss will be staggering. 3 cabinet ministers and the nation's newly appointed chief of the general staff will be gone in a single moment. In a country already adjusting to the uncertainty of global war, the accident will send shockwaves through both government and military leadership. But in the days and weeks that follow, investigators will begin asking a quieter question. How could a capable aircraft, flown by a trained military crew, descend unseen into terrain so close to the capital? The answer will not lie in a single failure. Instead, it will emerge from a chain of circumstances, weather, terrain, technology, and human judgment, interacting in ways that aviation, at the time, was still learning to understand. To comprehend the accident fully, it is necessary to step back from the hillside outside Canberra and examine the world in which the flight took place. A world at war, an aviation industry still young, and a system of navigation that relied, more than anything else, on what a pilot could see. In August 1940, Australia stood at a turning point. Less than a year earlier, the country had entered the widening conflict of World War II. The war was still in its early phase, but events unfolding across Europe were already reshaping the strategic calculations of governments around the world. For Australia, the war was both distant and immediate. Battles were being fought thousands of kilometers away, yet the decisions that would determine the nation's role were being made daily in the quiet administrative center of Canberra. At the time, Canberra was still a relatively small capital city. Wide avenues and government buildings stood surrounded by open land, farmland, and wooded hills. The city had been chosen deliberately as a neutral capital between Sydney and Melbourne, but its remote character also meant that travel to and from Canberra often required air transport. Rail journeys could take many hours. Roads were slow and weather-dependent. Aircraft, even in the early 1940s, provided the fastest connection between Australia's major cities and its growing wartime government. Australia at war. When war began in September 1939, Australia committed quickly to supporting Britain and the Allied cause. The government began mobilizing military forces, expanding aircraft production, and coordinating with Allied commands across the Pacific and Europe. These decisions demanded constant meetings between political leaders, military planners, and senior officers. Among the most influential figures involved in those decisions were 3 cabinet ministers scheduled to travel to Canberra on the morning of August 13th. One of them was Geoffrey Street, Australia's Minister for the Army. Street was responsible for overseeing the rapid expansion of Australian land forces as the country prepared for the possibility of global conflict spreading into the Pacific. Another passenger was James Fairbairn, the Minister for Air and Civil Aviation. Fairbairn had a unique perspective on aviation matters. He was not only responsible for Australia's air policy, but was also an experienced pilot himself. The 3rd cabinet minister aboard the aircraft was Henry Summer Goulet, Minister for Information, whose role involved managing wartime communication, media coordination, and public messaging during a period when morale and information control were considered essential. Traveling with them was another prominent figure in Australian military history. Brudenell White had recently been appointed Chief of the General Staff, the senior professional officer responsible for the Australian Army. White was widely respected for his organizational ability and his experience during the First World War. His appointment had been seen as a stabilizing force during the early months of the new global conflict. Together, these men represented a significant portion of Australia's wartime leadership. Their presence on a single aircraft would later become one of the most remarkable and tragic aspects of the accident. Military aviation in 1940. The aircraft transporting the officials belonged to the Royal Australian Air Force, which in 1940 was undergoing rapid expansion. Before the war, the IAF had been a relatively small force. But as global tensions increased, the demand for trained pilots, aircraft, and operational units rose dramatically. New aircraft were being delivered. Training programs were expanding. Airfields across the country were becoming busier. Among the aircraft entering service during this period was the Lockheed Hudson. Originally designed in the United States as a patrol bomber derived from the Lockheed Model 14 airliner, the Hudson combined relatively high speed with long range and reliable twin-engine performance. These qualities made it valuable for maritime patrol missions as well as transport duties. For the IAAF, the Hudson quickly became one of the most important aircraft in its early wartime inventory. It could patrol coastlines, carry equipment, and transport personnel across large distances. And because Australia's geography is vast, cities separated by hundreds or even thousands of kilometers, such aircraft were essential to keeping military and government operations connected. Flights carrying officials were not unusual. Senior leaders frequently traveled aboard military aircraft when schedules were tight or when urgent meetings required rapid movement between cities. The importance of Canberra. By 1940, Canberra had become the operational centre of Australia's wartime government. Cabinet meetings, military briefings, and intelligence discussions were held regularly within its government buildings. Ministers often travelled between major population centres, such as Melbourne and Sydney, before returning to Canberra for strategic consultations. Although the capital city itself was quiet and relatively small, the decisions made there shaped the country's war effort. Aircraft arriving in Canberra typically approached over the surrounding hills and farmland before landing at the local airfield. These hills were not extremely high by global standards, but they were significant enough to pose challenges in poor weather. In clear conditions, the terrain could easily be navigated visually, but winter weather sometimes changed that equation. Winter over the capital. August falls in the middle of the Australian winter. Cold air moving across southeastern Australia often brings low cloud, fog, and periods of reduced visibility. In the Canberra region, these conditions can settle into valleys and hills, obscuring landmarks that pilots normally rely upon for orientation. In 1940, aviation weather forecasting was far less sophisticated than it would later become. Meteorological reports existed, but radar weather detection and satellite monitoring were decades away. Pilots often had to rely on general forecasts and visual observations during flight. Under most circumstances, experienced crews could handle such conditions safely, but the margin for error became smaller when cloud concealed the terrain. The flight toward Canberra. On the morning of the 13th of August, 1940, the Hudson carrying the ministers departed on a routine journey toward Canberra. The aircraft was crewed by members of the Royal Australian Air Force and carried several of the country's most senior officials. From a technical perspective, nothing about the flight appeared unusual. The aircraft was functioning normally. The engines were operating correctly. The route was familiar. Yet aviation accidents rarely begin with dramatic warning signs. More often, they develop quietly. Weather conditions change. Visibility decreases. Pilots adapt their navigation methods to compensate. Each individual adjustment appears reasonable in the moment, but occasionally, those adjustments accumulate in ways that gradually reduce the crew's awareness of their exact position relative to the terrain. In aviation, this process is sometimes referred to as a loss of situational awareness. When it occurs during descent in poor visibility, a controlled aircraft can unknowingly approach the ground. The Hudson approaching Canberra that winter morning carried a heavy responsibility. Inside the cabin were individuals responsible for directing a nation at war. Outside the aircraft, low clouds were settling over the hills surrounding the capital. Within a short time, These two realities, national leadership in transit and terrain hidden by winter weather, would intersect in a way that no one aboard the aircraft could fully see. Understanding the events of the 1940 Canberra Air Disaster requires looking beyond the moment of impact. Aircraft accidents rarely result from a single failure. Instead, they tend to emerge from an interaction between multiple elements: technology, human decisions, environmental conditions, and operational systems. In aviation analysis, these elements are sometimes referred to as angles of investigation. For the Hudson flight approaching Canberra on the 13th of August, 1940, four of these angles stand out clearly. The aircraft, the crew, the environment, or the navigation systems of the era. Each played a role in shaping the conditions that existed during the final minutes of the flight. The aircraft involved in the flight was a Lockheed Hudson, operated by the Royal Australian Air Force. The Hudson was a relatively modern aircraft for its time. Developed by the American company Lockheed Corporation in the late 1930s, the design was based on the civilian Lockheed Model 14 Super Electra airliner. Engineers adapted the aircraft into a military patrol bomber by reinforcing its structure, adding defensive armament, and modifying the interior to carry equipment and crew. Despite its military role, the Hudson retained many characteristics of a transport aircraft. It was powered by two radial piston engines mounted on low-mounted wings. These engines provided reliable thrust and allowed the aircraft to maintain flight even if one engine failed, an important safety feature for long overwater patrols. The Hudson's performance was respectable for the period. Its cruising speed approached 240 miles per hour, and it could travel long distances without refueling. The aircraft was also considered stable in flight, which made it suitable for reconnaissance and patrol duties. However, like most aircraft of its era, the Hudson relied heavily on visual navigation. The cockpit contained a collection of analog instruments: altimeter, airspeed indicator, vertical speed indicator, compass, and engine gauges. These instruments allowed the pilot to maintain basic control of the aircraft, but they did not provide detailed information about the surrounding terrain. Modern systems, such as terrain awareness and warning systems, digital navigation maps, and radar altimeters, were still decades away. In 1940, pilots flying near mountainous or hilly terrain often depended on clear visibility to confirm their position relative to the ground. If cloud obscured the landscape, the margin for safe navigation narrowed considerably. The Hudson's crew consisted of trained members of the Royal Australian Air Force. During the early years of World War II, the RAF was expanding rapidly. New pilots were being trained, new aircraft were entering service, and operational tempo was increasing. This expansion created a demanding environment for crews. Pilots often flew multiple roles: transport flights, training missions, reconnaissance patrols, sometimes within the same week. Experience levels across the service varied widely, depending on how long each pilot had been flying military aircraft. The pilot responsible for the Hudson flight was considered competent and capable of operating the aircraft safely. However, the nature of wartime aviation meant that crews often operated under time pressure. Flights carrying senior officials could not easily be delayed without disrupting schedules and military coordination. Such pressures did not necessarily lead to poor decisions, but they could influence operational judgment. Pilots in that era also relied heavily on their own interpretation of weather conditions and terrain awareness. Unlike modern crews supported by extensive air traffic control systems and satellite navigation, wartime pilots frequently made navigation adjustments independently. Their training emphasized practical flying skills and experience rather than automated systems. In most situations, this method worked effectively, but in reduced visibility, the ability to determine exact position relative to terrain could become uncertain. The environment. The third angle in the investigation involves the landscape surrounding Canberra. Although Australia is often associated with wide, flat expanses, the region around the capital contains rolling hills and ridgelines that rise gradually toward the city. These hills are not extremely high, generally only a few hundred meters above the surrounding terrain, but they are significant enough to create hazards for aircraft flying at low altitude. One of the ridges near Canberra is Fairbairn Hill, a wooded slope that rises quietly above the surrounding land. In clear weather, the hill is easily visible from the air, but under low cloud, the ridge can disappear completely. On the morning of the 13th of August, 1940, winter weather had settled across the region. Low clouds and mist reduced visibility in the hills surrounding the capital. Such conditions are common during Canberra winters. Cold air moving across southeastern Australia often becomes trapped in valleys, forming fog and low cloud layers that obscure the terrain beneath. For pilots approaching the city, this meant that visual references could appear and disappear quickly. A ridge visible one moment might vanish the next as cloud drifted across it. Without reliable visual cues, determining altitude relative to the ground became more difficult. The systems of the era. The final angle concerns the navigation systems available in 1940. Aviation technology was advancing rapidly during the early 20th century, but many modern safety tools had not yet been invented. Pilots relied primarily on a combination of a magnetic compass headings, a paper navigation charts, a radio direction finding signals, of visual landmarks. Radio navigation aids did exist in limited forms. Ground-based radio transmitters could broadcast signals that allowed aircraft to determine their direction relative to the station. By interpreting these signals with onboard receivers, pilots could estimate their position. However, these systems were relatively primitive compared with modern instrument landing systems or satellite navigation. They provided guidance, but not precise three-dimensional positioning. Altimeters, meanwhile, measured altitude above sea level, not above the terrain directly below the aircraft. This distinction was critical. If a pilot misjudged the height of nearby hills relative to sea level, the altimeter alone would not prevent an aircraft from descending too close to the ground. Today, aircraft use radar altimeters that measure height above the surface directly beneath the aircraft. These devices provide immediate warning when altitude becomes dangerously low. But in 1940, such technology was not available. Pilots therefore relied on procedures that combined altitude awareness with visual confirmation of terrain. When the terrain itself vanished into cloud, that confirmation became impossible, converging factors. None of these factors alone guaranteed an accident. The Lockheed Hudson was capable. The IAF crew was trained. The terrain near Canberra was known to local pilots. And the navigation systems of the era, though limited, were widely used without incident. But aviation safety depends on the interaction between these elements. When visibility drops, terrain awareness becomes more difficult. When terrain awareness becomes uncertain, altitude margins become critical. And when altitude margins shrink without the crew realizing it, an aircraft can unknowingly approach the ground. This sequence of circumstances is known today as controlled flight into terrain, or CFIT. In such accidents, the aircraft remains fully functional. The engines run normally. The controls respond correctly. The crew believes the flight is proceeding safely. Only in the final moments does the true position of the aircraft relative to the terrain become clear. By that point, there may be little time to react. On the morning of the 13th of August, 1940, these factors were gradually converging in the skies above the hills outside Canberra. The Hudson, carrying Australia's senior wartime officials, continued its descent through the low cloud. Below the aircraft, the wooded slopes remained hidden, and the distance between aircraft and terrain was becoming smaller with every passing second. The next stage of the story unfolds during the final minutes of the flight. On the morning of the 13th of August, 1940, The Lockheed Hudson, operated by the Royal Australian Air Force, continued its flight toward Canberra. The journey itself was not unusually long. Aircraft regularly connected major Australian cities with the capital, carrying personnel, mail, and occasionally senior officials. The Hudson that day carried 10 men, crew and passengers, moving toward a routine day of wartime meetings. Outside the aircraft, however, the conditions surrounding the capital were beginning to close in. Low winter cloud covered much of the region. In places, the ceiling dropped close to the surrounding hills, leaving only narrow gaps between the terrain and the base of the clouds. For pilots approaching Canberra during clear weather, the landscape normally provided reliable visual cues. The hills, valleys, and open farmland formed a recognizable pattern visible from several miles away. But under the gray blanket of cloud that morning, those visual references were fading. The final approach begins. As the Hudson approached the Canberra area, the crew began preparing for descent. The aircraft remained mechanically sound. Both engines were operating normally. There were no indications of structural problems or system failures. In aviation accident analysis, this distinction is important. When an aircraft continues to operate correctly, investigators begin looking more closely at the interaction between navigation, environment, and human perception. The Hudson began to descend toward the capital through layers of cloud. Inside the cockpit, the pilot monitored the instruments that formed the foundation of 1940-era aviation navigation. The altimeter indicated the aircraft's height above sea level. The magnetic compass maintained heading. The airspeed indicator confirmed that the aircraft remained within safe flight parameters. Each instrument provided accurate information, but each also represented only a single dimension of the aircraft's position. None of them could show the rising terrain concealed within the cloud. The landscape beneath the clouds. Below the Hudson lay the hills surrounding Canberra. Among them was a wooded ridge rising quietly above the surrounding land. Today the area is known as Fairbairn Hill, a modest elevation that blends naturally into the terrain of the region. From the ground, the hill appears gentle, but from the air, particularly in low visibility, its slopes can emerge suddenly from the surrounding mist. On that winter morning, the ridge was completely obscured by cloud. Pilots approaching the city could not rely on visual confirmation of its location. Instead, they had to depend on altitude estimates and their interpretation of position relative to the capital. Descent through cloud. The Hudson continued descending toward Canberra. The aircraft was under full control. The engines maintained steady power. The controls responded normally. At this stage, there was no emergency. Yet aviation history has shown that some of the most dangerous situations develop quietly, without obvious warning signs. Controlled flight into terrain, CFIT, occurs when a fully functioning aircraft unknowingly approaches the ground. In such cases, the aircraft may appear stable until the final seconds of flight. Inside the Hudson's cockpit, the instruments showed that the aircraft was descending within expected parameters, but the surrounding cloud prevented the crew from visually confirming their exact position relative to the hills below. In modern aviation, this is the moment when technology often intervenes. A terrain awareness system might display nearby terrain on a digital map. A radar altimeter might alert the crew that the aircraft was approaching the ground too quickly. A ground proximity warning system might generate an audible alarm. In 1940, those technologies did not exist. The crew's understanding of the aircraft position depended entirely on their interpretation of altitude, navigation estimates, and the expectation that terrain beneath them remained safely below their flight path. The final seconds. As the Hudson descended through the cloud layer, the wooded slopes of Fairbairn Hill lay directly ahead. From the cockpit, the hillside remained invisible. The aircraft's instruments continued to display normal readings. The descent continued. Then, suddenly, the ground appeared. A dark shape of trees and rising terrain emerged through the mist. At that moment, the distance between aircraft and hillside had already become dangerously small. In aviation accident reconstructions, the precise actions taken during the final seconds are often difficult to determine. Investigators must rely on physical evidence, aircraft performance characteristics, and the geometry of the impact site. What is known is that the Hudson struck the hillside while still under power. The impact occurred at speed. There was no evidence of a mid-air breakup or mechanical failure before contact with the terrain. The aircraft had flown directly into the slope. Immediate consequences. The collision destroyed the aircraft and ended the flight instantly. All 10 people aboard were killed. Among them were the senior wartime leaders traveling to Canberra. A Jeffrey Street, James Fairbairn, a Henry Summer Gould, a Broodnell White. For Australia, the loss was extraordinary. Rarely had a single aviation accident claimed such a concentration of national leadership. The hillside outside Canberra, quiet and wooded, had suddenly become the site of one of the most significant tragedies in Australian political and military history. Understanding the accident. The accident itself lasted only a moment, but the conditions that allowed it to occur had developed gradually. Cloud obscured the terrain. Navigation systems of the era provided only limited positional awareness. Altitude estimates may not have fully accounted for the rising hills surrounding Canberra. The aircraft remained functional. The crew remained in control. Yet the combination of these factors allowed the Hudson to descend unknowingly into the slope. In aviation analysis, this chain of events forms a classic structure of controlled flight into terrain. The aircraft does not fail. Instead, situational awareness gradually erodes until terrain appears too late to avoid. On that winter morning in 1940, the final link in that chain was completed on the wooded slopes just outside Canberra. What followed next would unfold not in the sky, but on the ground, through investigation, national mourning, and the search for answers. News of the crash spread quickly across Australia. In the early afternoon of the 13th of August, 1940, reports began reaching officials in Canberra that a military aircraft had failed to arrive as scheduled. Communication networks in 1940 were far slower than modern aviation systems, but the absence of the aircraft soon raised concern. Search efforts began almost immediately. Personnel from the Royal Australian Air Force and local authorities started examining the hills surrounding the capital. Because the weather conditions remained poor, locating the aircraft was not straightforward. Low clouds still covered parts of the terrain. Visibility across the ridges was limited. Eventually, searchers discovered the wreckage on the wooded slopes of Fairbairn Hill, only a short distance from Canberra itself. The aircraft had struck the hillside with considerable force. For investigators arriving at the scene, the first priority was confirmation of the passengers and crew aboard the aircraft. That confirmation brought the scale of the tragedy into focus. Among the victims were 3 members of the Australian cabinet. Jeffrey Street, Minister for the Army James Fairbairn, Minister for Air and Civil Aviation Henry Summer Gould, Minister for Information. Also killed was the recently appointed Chief of the General Staff, Broodnell White. The accident quickly became known as the 1940 Canberra Air Disaster. It was not only an aviation tragedy. It was a national crisis, national shock. Australia in 1940 was still adjusting to the early phase of World War II. Government ministers were deeply involved in organizing the country's military expansion and coordinating with Allied forces abroad. The loss of 3 cabinet members in a single accident was unprecedented. Newspapers across the country reported the news with somber headlines. The deaths of senior leaders during wartime raised immediate concerns about political continuity and military leadership. Cabinet positions would need to be filled, responsibilities reassigned, and wartime planning maintained despite the sudden absence of key figures. Beyond the political implications, The accident also carried a strong emotional impact. Many Australians recognized the names of the men aboard the aircraft. Some had served in public life for years. Others were known for their roles in earlier military service or political leadership. The accident therefore resonated both as a personal loss and as a national event. Memorial services were held to honor those who had died. For the families of the victims, the tragedy was deeply personal. For the nation, it marked one of the most significant losses of leadership in Australian history. Beginning the investigation. At the same time, investigators began examining the circumstances surrounding the crash. The aircraft involved was a Lockheed Hudson, a relatively new addition to the Royal Australian Air Force fleet. Understanding why the aircraft had struck terrain so close to its destination became the central question. Accident investigation procedures in 1940 were less formalized than those used today, but the fundamental principles were already established. Investigators examined the wreckage of the aircraft, of the terrain of the crash site, or weather conditions at the time of the flight, the aircraft's known flight path. Because the aircraft had impacted terrain at speed, much of the structure had been severely damaged. However, investigators found no evidence suggesting a catastrophic mechanical failure prior to the collision. Both engines appeared to have been operating at the time of impact. There were no indications that the aircraft had suffered a structural breakup in the air. These findings pointed investigators toward a particular category of accident, one in which a functioning aircraft collides with terrain due to navigation or situational awareness issues. Today, aviation safety experts refer to such accidents as controlled flight into terrain, or CFIT. Weather and terrain. Weather conditions became a key part of the investigation. Reports from the Canberra region confirmed that low cloud and reduced visibility had been present during the morning of the accident. Such conditions could obscure the hills surrounding the capital, making visual navigation more difficult. Investigators also studied the topography of the crash location. The wooded ridge where the aircraft struck rose gradually from the surrounding terrain. While not extremely high, it was tall enough that an aircraft descending through cloud could encounter it unexpectedly if altitude margins were insufficient. In clear weather, pilots approaching Canberra could easily identify the surrounding hills. But when cloud covered the terrain, those visual cues disappeared. Without visual confirmation, crews had to rely entirely on altitude estimates and navigation calculations. If those estimates were even slightly inaccurate, the risk of terrain collision increased. Limitations of the era. Another factor examined by investigators was the aviation technology available in 1940. Modern aircraft carry multiple systems designed specifically to prevent CFIT accidents. Terrain awareness displays warn pilots when mountains or hills lie ahead. Radar altimeters measure height above the ground directly beneath the aircraft. Ground proximity warning systems issue audible alerts when altitude becomes dangerously low. None of these systems existed in 1940. The Hudson's instruments provided reliable information about speed, altitude relative to sea level, and engine performance. But they could not warn the crew that rising terrain lay hidden inside the cloud. This technological limitation was common throughout aviation at the time. Many aircraft relied on a combination of radio navigation signals and visual confirmation of the landscape. When weather conditions eliminated that visual confirmation, the margin for safe descent became much narrower. Findings. The investigation ultimately concluded that the aircraft had descended into terrain while still under control. There was no evidence of sabotage, structural failure, or engine malfunction. Instead, the accident appeared to have resulted from the interaction between low visibility, terrain, and navigation limitations. The Hudson had approached Canberra through cloud. The hillside remained hidden until it was too late for the crew to avoid it. A national memory. Although the investigation produced technical findings, the public memory of the accident focused largely on its human consequences. The deaths of 3 cabinet ministers and a senior military officer created a moment of profound reflection within Australian political life. In the years that followed, the accident remained one of the most notable tragedies in the country's aviation history, but its significance also extended beyond the loss of leadership. The event highlighted a broader issue that aviation around the world was still learning to address: the danger of controlled aircraft encountering unseen terrain. In later decades, preventing such accidents would become a major focus of aviation safety development. The lessons learned from accidents like the one outside Canberra would eventually shape new technologies, new procedures, and new approaches to pilot training. The quiet hillside where the Hudson struck would remain a reminder of how aviation safety evolves, often through hard-earned experience. In aviation history, the meaning of an accident is rarely confined to the moment it occurs. The impact of the 1940 Canberra Air Disaster extended far beyond the wooded slopes outside Canberra. The loss of 10 lives, among them senior members of Australia's wartime leadership, left a mark not only on government and military institutions, but also on the evolving field of aviation safety. In the years following the crash, aviation around the world began confronting a persistent and difficult category of accidents: aircraft that were fully functional, pilots who were properly trained, flights that appeared routine. Yet, under certain circumstances, these aircraft would descend into terrain that crews could not see. This pattern eventually became known as controlled flight into terrain, or CFIT. The Hudson accident near Canberra represented an early example of the problem: understanding controlled flight into terrain. The defining characteristic of CFIT accidents is that the aircraft remains under control until the moment of impact. There is no catastrophic engine failure, no structural breakup, no loss of flight control. Instead, the aircraft continues flying normally while the crew gradually loses awareness of its exact position relative to the ground. In the case of the Hudson flight in 1940, the aircraft descended through low cloud toward the hills surrounding Canberra. The crew relied on altitude readings and navigation estimates available at the time, but the surrounding terrain was hidden inside the cloud layer. When the wooded ridge of Fairbairn Hill finally emerged from the mist, there was little opportunity to avoid it. Modern aviation investigators would later recognize this sequence as a classic CFIT scenario. Understanding this pattern would become one of the most important steps toward preventing similar accidents in the future. Technological change. In the decades after the accident, aviation technology advanced dramatically. New systems were developed specifically to prevent aircraft from unknowingly approaching terrain. One of the most important of these innovations was the radar altimeter. Unlike traditional altimeters, which measure altitude above sea level, radar altimeters measure the aircraft's height directly above the ground beneath it. This information gives pilots a much clearer understanding of how close they are to the surface. Another major development was the Ground Proximity Warning System, commonly known as GPWS. These systems monitor aircraft altitude, descent rate, and terrain proximity. If the system detects an aircraft is approaching terrain too quickly, it issues a clear and unmistakable warning to the crew. In modern cockpits, these warnings are often spoken aloud. Terrain, pull up. Later generations of aircraft introduced terrain awareness and warning systems, which combine digital terrain databases with satellite navigation to display nearby hills and mountains directly on cockpit screens. Pilots today can see the terrain surrounding their aircraft, even when clouds hide the landscape outside the cockpit windows. None of these technologies existed when the Hudson approached Canberra in 1940. At the time, pilots relied primarily on instruments designed for aircraft control rather than terrain awareness. The difference between those systems and modern technology represents one of the most significant advances in aviation safety. Procedural lessons. Technology alone, however, does not explain the evolution of aviation safety. Procedures and training have also changed substantially. Modern aviation emphasizes strict minimum safe altitudes when flying in areas where terrain may be hidden by weather. Pilots are trained to maintain altitude margins that guarantee safe clearance above surrounding terrain even when visibility is poor. Instrument approach procedures have also become far more precise. Airports now publish detailed descent profiles that guide aircraft safely toward landing while maintaining safe distance from terrain. Air traffic control systems provide additional layers of monitoring and support. Together, these procedures reduce the likelihood that an aircraft will unknowingly descend into hills or mountains. Remembering the people. While the technical lessons of the accident influenced aviation safety, the human impact remained central to the way the event was remembered. The deaths of Jeffrey Street, James Fairbairn, and Henry Summer Goulet removed 3 senior ministers from the Australian government during a critical phase of World War II. The loss of Broodnell White also deprived the Australian Army of one of its most experienced leaders. Their deaths reshaped wartime leadership within the country. Cabinet positions had to be filled quickly. Military command structures adjusted to the sudden absence of senior officers. Yet beyond these institutional consequences, the accident was also remembered for the individuals themselves, public servants, officers, and crew members who had been traveling on what was expected to be a routine flight. In Canberra, the hills surrounding the city remained quiet. The wooded slopes that once hid the Hudson in clouds still overlook the capital. Over time, the landscape has changed little, but the aviation world above it has changed profoundly. Aviation's quiet evolution. The story of aviation safety is often written gradually. Each accident reveals new vulnerabilities. Each investigation identifies weaknesses in technology, procedures, or human understanding. Over time, those lessons accumulate. New instruments are introduced. New training methods emerge. New systems are designed to prevent old mistakes from repeating themselves. The Hudson crash near Canberra became part of that broader history. It demonstrated how easily a controlled aircraft could encounter unseen terrain when visibility disappeared and navigation tools were limited. And it reinforced a lesson that aviation would continue to confront for decades. Knowing exactly where the ground is matters just as much as knowing how to fly the aircraft. Closing reflection. On the morning of the 13th of August, 1940, a twin-engine Hudson descended through winter cloud toward Canberra. Inside the aircraft were 10 men traveling to a day of wartime responsibilities. The aircraft itself was capable. The crew was trained. The flight appeared routine. But within the cloud layer above the hills, visibility vanished. The landscape disappeared, and the distance between aircraft and terrain quietly closed. The accident lasted only a moment. Its consequences lasted far longer. Today, aircraft flying above those same hills carry layers of technology designed to prevent exactly that situation from happening again. Pilots see terrain on digital displays. Warning systems speak when altitude becomes unsafe. Procedures ensure that aircraft remain well clear of hidden hills and mountains. These systems exist because aviation has learned, step by step, from events like the one outside Canberra. The hills remain. The clouds still gather in winter, but the sky above them has become safer. And the quiet lessons of that morning in 1940 continue to shape how aircraft fly today.